Hi, everyone. Welcome to the invasive macrophyte management strand. We're going to go ahead and get started. And our first presenter today is Dr. Andrew Skibo, and he is a certified lake manager and the president of Amaruq Environmental Services in Missoula, Montana. He has over 16 years of experience as an aquatics technical specialist, supporting stakeholders, resource management agencies, and application companies across Western United States, where he focuses on investigating herbicide mode of action and the identification and management of terrestrial riparian and aquatic weed species. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Skibo.
Great, good morning, thank you. So today I want to talk about aquatic herbicides, modes of action, history, and applications. So before we jump into it, who here applies aquatic pesticides? Great, this presentation is actually not for you. It's for everybody else who is just kind of like, what are these people talking about? Background has already been kind of run through, so I don't want to waste any time on that unless anybody cares to identify the weed I'm holding in my hand. You nailed it. Dalmatian toadflax. Really interesting. It's going to be kind of hard to see in the background. I just really like this picture because it makes me look so handsome. But not kidding. Really interesting. This particular plant came out of the floodplain of the South Fork of the Shoshone River. That plant was pulled out in like late June, I believe it was, and that is a single season seedling. So that plant started after high water came through on this river. It established on one of the sandbanks, and within 4 weeks put out almost 3 feet of rhizome. So just talks about invasive species here in the state. So today I want to talk about herbicide history, kind of 101. How did we get here? Where did we come from? The aquatic herbicide portfolio, I've been calling it the applicator's toolbox for years, but it doesn't do us any good to have these tools available, not know what they are, not know what they're good at, but also know what they're not so good at. We'll talk about herbicide mode of action. So this is how these things actually function on a molecular level within the plant. This is normally the part of the presentation where my wife's eyes roll into the back of her head. We'll talk briefly about some invasives in Montana, and then if we have any time left, if anybody's still awake when I'm done, we'll go over some questions. So before we even get into chemistry, I want to talk about the history of herbicides and sort of, again, how we got here. Now, herbicides really didn't hit the market until the middle of the last century, and I mean that on a commercial level. So this graph is looking at U.S. food production from 1900 to the year 2010, and you can kind of see that seasonal fluctuations, crops, what have you, it really just kind of ran on a flat line through the 50s and probably looked much like this in the earlier part of the century as well. This came as a result of some pretty significant changes in the agricultural world. Primarily in 1913, these two rather dour-looking German fellows, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, 1913, developed synthetic fertilizer. Now, why did it not have an impact on agriculture until the late 40s? Well, they didn't develop synthetic fertilizer for use on fields. They actually developed it for use in artillery shells, and that kind of continued all the way through World War I, all the way through World War II, and it wasn't until after those last global conflicts that we actually had a use for these fertilizers. The other point here is what happened right about here, middle of last century. Let's call it 1946. Anybody with world history remember what happened in 1946? World War II ended, right? So, with World War II, we saw the first commercial herbicide. Does anybody know what that commercial herbicide was? 2,4-D, exactly. So, 2,4-D was actually known as Weed Dun, came out in 1946, but we developed it in 1941. Now, we used it on our enemies in World War II, and so it wasn't really available until after the end of the war, and all of a sudden the government was sitting on an ocean of 2,4-D, trying to figure out what to do with it. So we launched it in 1946, 2,4-D. Now 1946 and the period thereafter saw some interesting advertisements come out of no relation, but around the same time we got this handy pamphlet from DuPont called Farming with Dynamite. Advertisements such as doctors recommending cigarettes, and then children's books that came out. Only one of these was actually not real. Now, I was hoping that somebody would say their first herbicide was salt, right? Missoula winters are really long. We get kind of bored in the wintertime, and I have a lot of times on my hand. But I have frequently heard in these presentations, well, what about salt? Wasn't salt the first herbicide? Who here has heard about salting fields, right? Salting the fields of Carthage. That kind of stuck in my mind because I was like, well, how much salt would you actually have to put in a field to have a result? So I did the math. We don't normally see crop injury as a result of salinity or sodium chloride until we hit about 230 mig per liter or 230 part per million salt concentration. Well, if you remember that an acre of soil, 6 to 7 inches deep, that ag layer, estimated weight of that soil is about 2 million pounds. So if we had to hit 230 ppm, remember the minimum concentration for salt injury, I'd have to put about 460 pounds of salt per acre out. Okay, not really hard to do that, right? Well, then I did some further reading, and I found out that Diocletian, AD 284 to 305, actually set the price of salt at maximum of 100 denarii for 46 pounds of salt. This is important because the average soldier of the day was paid 3 denarii. You can actually look back at the Roman Empire and they have these records. So it would take 57 days worth of labor to basically afford enough salt to kill 1 acre of field. Okay. You're all Roman soldiers. You're on enemy territory. I give you the equivalent of almost 2 months of your salary. What are you going to do with it? You're sure as hell not going to throw it on the ground, right? So the important thing here to remember is that all the way back at the turn of the century, people were bitching about their paychecks too. All right. This chart is interesting. It's the newest one from the 8-track. This is Herbicides 101. This is every single herbicide mode of action known to mankind today. And I've been giving the variations of this presentation for the last decade. And I can recall, I think 8 years ago, where we had 28 modes of action. Today, we have 35 different classes. We're going to talk about each and every single one of them. I'm kidding. The first one on here, 1946, remember that was 2,4-D, right? The latest one, 2013, I think actually slightly older than that, but this is, talk about that in a sec. The period of 1960 to 1980, this is a chart from Ian Heap talking about the various classes as they were invented over time. And so we can go back to 1930 all the way to 2000. Now, there have been other classes that have come out of here, but in the world of aquatics, our first one, our flagship molecule outside of 2,4-D was fluridone. Has anybody heard of fluridone? Pretty common. Yep. You guys who apply it on a daily basis don't get to raise your hand. But this is a carotenoid biosynthesis inhibitor. I'll talk briefly about what that means in a minute. So that's 1973. Just for information's sake, glyphosate, we saw here. Here we have topramazone. And then not even on this list is the latest herbicide, fluoroperoxyfen benzyl, which I believe will be talked about later today. So I won't spend any more time on that. It's important, though, to know that every single mode of action that we have available to us in the world of aquatics originally came from agriculture. So, again, if you invented the greatest synthetic herbicide today and you wanted to put it in ponds and lakes, there is absolutely no way you would get that product registered if it had no use in aquatics. This is important when we talk about this toolbox and what we have available to us, because it's not like on the crop side where we have this huge pipeline coming and always all these new actives. If there is no use in crops, we will never see it. So if we go back to this toolbox, I want to zoom in on this category. These are our auxin mimics. So again, the first class that we had available to us. So here's 2,4-D again. Go out to dicamba. Anybody heard of dicamba, right? Mainly issues in dicamba resistant crops being treated right next door to non-resistant crops. We've got aminopyrrolid, 2005, and then I referenced fluoroperoxyfen, that was 2017. And fluoroperoxyfen is the latest active ingredient to be registered in the world of aquatics. So even that was what, 7 years ago? We haven't seen anything since then. Now, it's important to talk about herbicide resistance. The first case of herbicide resistance was documented in the 1950s. Well, do you remember when 2,4-D came out? Mid-40s, right? We saw it on everybody's favorite garden plant, bindweed. First case of resistance. So about 10 years after we launched it, we saw it. And you can actually follow this trend through over the decades. As we released a mode of action, typically within about 10 years, we start to see cases of resistance pop up. Now, this is on the agricultural side. I started on the ag side, and this is kind of interesting. There is water hemp in the southeast now that is 6-class resistant. So it really speaks to the genetic plasticity and the ability of weeds to kind of combat and develop defenses against how we're trying to kill them. Now, the next question comes up, well, what about aquatics? Have we seen cases of resistance in aquatics? And Ryan Thum, who I think is talking later today, I'll not steal his thunder. He can talk about that. He certainly has previously. We have seen cases of resistance in aquatics. They have not been nearly as widespread as we've seen in agriculture. And I don't really have a clear answer as to why that case is, because again, we have far fewer tools available to us in aquatics than we do on the ag side. So it stands to reason that we're using these actives more frequently than we are in on the crop side. We just haven't seen many cases of resistance crop up, so kind of interesting. These are 2 articles which nobody can read from way back there. That's okay, because I can't read them when I download them. This is our toolbox, right? So you remember that big graphic I showed you earlier with the 300 distinct chemistries on there and I think 35 modes of action? When we move into aquatics, so now we are treating in and around water, we have 11. Now, these 11 modes of action can be categorized as to how they work. So we've got fast contact type herbicides. So these are ones that we put out, and generally within 8 to 24 hours, we're going to start seeing results. Diquat is a great example of this. Anybody heard of Diquat? 1, 2, how about copper? Copper, contact herbicide, very fast acting. Next, we have what I refer to as transitional. Now, these are systemic herbicides. They do move throughout the plant after treatment, but I refer to them as systemics because the control we get from these is typically more in line with what we see with contacts. On the aquatic side, you can get good results with the growth regulators. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is on the riparian side, if I spray mare's tail, anybody sprayed mare's tail ever, seen mare's tail? If you hit it with triclopyr, what do you typically see? You know, that plant shoots up to about 2 feet, you burn the top, and then what does it do? It keeps growing. Right? So you get some burn down from it, but you're not really getting control. And that's on an annual. Next, we've got the slow type or systemics. And the poster child for this one by default has always been glyphosate or Roundup. Anybody ever used Roundup? Yeah? 1, 2, have you and your family ever been exposed? You put out Roundup or you put out glyphosate. How long does it take to start seeing those results? A week, 2 weeks, it depends. I'm going to talk about why that is, but that is very indicative of a systemic herbicide. They do move throughout the plant. Typically 24 hours post-application, they are present from the root all the way to the growth points, but you won't see the results for a while, and I'll talk about why in a minute. This is our aquatics toolbox, right? This is all aquatic uses anywhere. When I talk about irrigation, which I'm not going to talk about today, but when I do talk about irrigation, this is the toolbox I have available to me. So when you hear us up here talking about product stewardship and rotation and managing the cases of resistance, this is why. Because in each one of our use cases, we could very easily lose the most effective tool we have And now we're left with a bunch of tools that are maybe not so great, or maybe have some detrimental impacts to non-target organisms. We go back to our contact type herbicides. These are generally used in burn down programs. So we go out in the spring, we're going to flood a retention basin, or we've just got some nuisance vegetation floating on top of a pond. I want to get rid of it. I'm going to go out and apply a burn down program, get rid of that vegetation. Think here the Quentin Tarantino effect, right? Rapid and violent death. I'm going to spray these plants, and within 24 to 48, like, they are having a really terrible day. Now, I've got pictures here of some defense mechanisms that plants have developed. On the top, we've got velvet leaf, if you've ever seen that one. It's got really hairy leaf surface. If you don't have a surfactant package in there, those water droplets are actually going to stand up on that leaf hair and not touch the plant. Cattails. Anybody ever seen cattails? Vertically oriented, waxy leaf surface. If you don't have a surfactant in there, those droplets are going to run right off. Now your herbicide is not where you want it. So with contact herbicides, we'll take a look at two here. This is flumioxazin. You might know this as Clipper or Flumigard. It is a PPO inhibitor, a protoporphyrinogen oxidase inhibitor, which is basically associated with the stepping down of electrons in photosynthesis. If I prevent plants from doing that, they basically produce free radicals. And I'm not talking about the kind you can find standing in front of the Missoula County Courthouse. I'm talking about the kind that actually do some pretty terrible things to you. The reason we eat blueberries and drink cranberry juice, we are trying to prevent lipid peroxidation. Well, what the hell is that? Well, lipid peroxidation is basically breaking that cell wall. If we break the cell wall, it stands to reason the plant's going to have a pretty terrible day. Pretty common injury pattern here. Now, this is looking at soybeans. But from here, we progress, the plants die, right? Okay. Next one we'll look at is diquat. Diquat is a photosystem 1 inhibitor, different class of action. But again, that PPO statement shouldn't be in there, my apologies. But what we're actually seeing is the generation of free radicals. Again, this occurs very quickly in plants, especially on a sunny day. So that's why we want to spray our plants when it's sunny out, right? So here we are generating free radicals. Typical symptomology here. Does anybody want to guess what happens next? Yeah, they die. Awesome. All right. Systemic type herbicides. These are the ones that are going to go on a plant leaf surface, and they're going to move through that phloem. They're going to move down into the reproductive structures. So typically we're going to use these on perennial or biennial species. The symptoms can be very slow to manifest in the plants. And again, weed height is generally critical with these. So smaller plants, easier to control than bigger plants. Think of this as slow lingering death, but you're generally going to kill the whole plant, which on biennials and perennials is the goal, right? So we'll look at fluridone. You guys have heard of fluridone as a PDS or phytoene desaturase inhibitor. This one's actually kind of cool. What does phytoene desaturase do? Well, phytoene desaturase in plants is critical to the formation of secondary pigments, right? So your xanthophylls, your carotenoids, all of those. The plants that turn, or the leaves that turn color in the fall. Is anybody completely bored yet? If I inhibit PDS in plants, it starts this whole enzymatic pathway of really bad things happening. But fluridone is really cool to see in plants because it's called a bleacher. It turns the plants white. It is the only mode of action that you're going to see this. If you've ever put fluridone out on, say, milfoil, which it's very effective on, generally 2 to 3 weeks post-treatment, you can actually see those tips turn bright white. So it's really good diagnostic to get in the field if you're trying to figure out what happened. If you see white, bad news. So without secondary pigments, again, the plants can't step down that sunlight energy from chlorophyll. They form free radicals. Anybody want to guess what happens next? They die. All right, finally, we'll look at glyphosate. Glyphosate is kind of interesting. Glyphosate is an EPS-PS inhibitor, 5-enoyl pyruvyl shikimate 3 phosphatase. Nailed it. What the hell is that? Well, it prevents the formation of aromatic amino acids. What do aromatic amino acids do in plants? They do a whole bunch of things, primarily protein synthesis, secondary metabolite formation, right? it takes a while for that plant to actually show symptoms because it's starving to death. This doesn't happen overnight, but it typically starts with interveinal chlorosis. The plants turn yellow, they get more yellow, they get even more yellow, and then 3 weeks later, what happens? They die. All right. Finally, we'll look at imazamox, and I'll go through this one. Imazamox is similar in how it functions in plants, except unlike an aromatic amino acid inhibitor, it is a branch chain amino acid inhibitor, also known as an ALS inhibitor. And these ALSs do all kinds of things from protein synthesis, amino acid production. Again, this is how plants make food. Well, if I turn that off, I can't make these amino acids. Symptoms again here typically manifest first in the growth points. So where those plants need those nutrients, they turn brown, they turn yellow, they turn yellow, then they turn brown. 3 to 4 weeks later, what happens? They die. All right, I'm almost done, thankfully. One point we need to make clear is that in the world of aquatics, it's not like spraying parking lots. It's not like spraying railroads or soybean fields. We need to maintain an adequate concentration for that plant that we're targeting to get rid of it. So first, we need a molecule that has activity on our target plant. Where do we find this information? On the label, right? Second, we need a label that has approved use sites on it. And this is really important in our world because all aquatic sites are not equal, right? I work in irrigation ditches all the time, and people bring me labels. Well, hey, this says ditch. A drainage ditch is not an irrigation ditch, and that speaks to the risk of what it is exactly we're doing in the environment. So we need a label that is approved for my use site. Then we need to meet the concentration or rate for a set period of time, which is our exposure, to achieve control. And I'm going to throw out fluridone here just because I've worked with it for so many years, but fluridone is very effective on Eurasian water milfoil at very low rates. 5 ppm for a few weeks and you will strip out Eurasian water milfoil. If you have northern milfoil, you need to be a slightly higher rate. So that actually speaks to the rate selectivity of fluridone. It's a pretty cool tool that you can go out there at specific rates and take care of specific species. Finally, I'm not going to belabor this issue because other people are speaking about this today, but the state of Montana, I believe, has 47 species listed from priority 1A all the way down to priority 3. Whoops. Some of these are yellow star thistle, purple loosestrife, our friends Eurasian milfoil, toadflax, shows you a picture of that earlier. Hydrilla, I don't believe we have in the state yet, but it's kind of on the lookout list. It's one of those species that we definitely don't want to see out here. With that, I would like to thank the Montana Invasive Species Council. I would like to thank the Department of Ecology here. This is the second year for putting this presentation on. And again, thank you all for coming. We can't have these presentations if you guys don't show up. You could have these star-studded speaker banners like myself, but if I'm just sitting here talking to myself, that's a typical day at my house, right? It's really important for you all to come to these meetings. And so if there is anything that could be done better, if there are topics that you want to see covered in future iterations of this course, please let people know, okay? With that, I realize I've just talked for almost 30 minutes about aquatic herbicides. I made 3/4 of it up. If you have any questions about this, I think we have a minute or two for talk. Yep. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? Not even one? Go for it.
How active are you in educating the people adjacent to where you're at for what you're doing?
The question is, how active am I in talking to folks outside of aquatics about what we're doing?
Well, adjacent too. So you say you spend a lot of time on irrigation ditches.
Mm-hmm.
So your ditches obviously run through multiple types of landowners.
Yep.
Are you active in educating those landowners for what you're doing and the benefit, or are you relying on someone else?
Yes. Great question. So under the banner of Amaruq Environmental Services, we bill ourselves as comprehensive land and water resource management. So when I'm doing applications, whether it's an irrigation ditch or a drinking water reservoir, we are very proactive in getting out in front of stakeholders and letting them know exactly what we're doing. We don't have anything to hide here, and I would rather have conversations with stakeholders about what we're doing to their water, our water. You know, our mission here is to leave the water in better case than we found it. You know, I've got kids, I've got a family. I'm not putting anything in our drinking water that is going to impact me negatively. But when it comes to management of invasive and nuisance species, quite honestly, herbicides are a very effective tool at doing that and are often less intrusive than other means. So, great question. Yes, Terry?
That slide back that showed the invasive
This is just a very small list. If you go to the MISC site, it'll show all of them. Again, there's about 47 out there. And what I will say as managers, as stakeholders out there in the environment, you don't need to know all of them. You sure as hell don't need to know every single herbicide that I just talked about today. But if you pick one, you know, pick one herbicide, pick one weed, learn something about that. And then when you're out there in the environment and you see it, become that expert. Now you can start putting the mission out there about what we're doing and why.
We have time for one more question if there's anything else.
No. Will you share your presentation?
Yes, the presentation I will make available as PDF to anybody that asks for it. I don't know if they intend to upload it to the county website.
I think Becca might be making a video too,
Okay.
a recording of all the presentations. I'm not certain. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's possible.
Yeah, I'm happy to make this available. And quite honestly, if you ever have questions about any of the things that I've talked about today, we do that all the time. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr.